This story is a fictional narrative inspired by real-life emotions and everyday experiences. The rain falling on the skyscrapers of New York is like no rain I've ever known. It's cold, distant, and loud in a careless way. Sitting in my small apartment with a cold cup of tea, I closed my eyes and suddenly I couldn't hear the car horns or the hum of the heater anymore. Instead, I heard the wind blowing through endless cornfields in Ohio, and the warm, slightly raspy voice of my mother telling me about a time when everything still seemed magical. Your father was 17, Lily, the smartest in his school, tall, handsome, like a movie star. In those told memories, Robert, or Bob, as everyone called him, wasn't the quiet man who frowned in the kitchen corner. He was a young man with eyes as deep blue as a summer sky and a mind that could puzzle his teachers. He added a year to his papers just so he could put on a soldier's uniform, so he could go and see the world beyond the Appalachian Mountains. In Grandma's stories, he was a hero. He saved a lost dog from a deep ditch. He fixed a neighbor's tractor with just a few skilled moves. He understood numbers and technical drawings like they were his first language. I pictured him back then, walking with confidence, broad shoulders, carrying the air of faraway places right there in a small town where everyone knew each other. And then my mind's eye turns to the girl with hair as shiny gold as wheat at summer's end, Sharon, my mother. The town's flower, everyone said so. The black and white photos in the old album prove it. A beauty that needed no makeup, with a bright smile and dimpled cheeks. Her world was small and gentle. It smelled like hay in the afternoon. It was the cold feel of fresh eggs from the coop. It was the steady sound of her own mother's sewing machine making dresses for local girls. She had never been farther than Columbus, had never seen the ocean, had never read the thick philosophy books the man she would marry loved so much. Her life was a warm circle, centered on family, church, and the field at the end of the road. They got married. Everyone said they were the perfect couple, the promising young engineer and the prettiest girl in the area. Their wedding photos show them smiling bright as the sun, Dad in a sharp suit, Mom in a puffy white dress her own mother made. But me, 30 years later, sitting in an apartment hundreds of miles away, I always wonder, what did they talk about on those first evenings together? When one had seen the world from Asian ports to Middle Eastern deserts, and the other's heart and memories were only as wide as the cornfield down the road? Could the admiration in that young girl's eyes fill the space between adventure stories and talk about the weather and the crops? Then, the glow began to shimmer in my memory, like pieces of broken glass in the noon sun. It was the image of the company car, a sleek dark blue, bringing Dad home every Friday evening. Its engine sounded important, different from the old pickup trucks in town. His step out of that car carried the air of success, of a world of air-conditioned offices and big projects. He brought home the area's first color TV, a big, shiny wood-paneled box, where all the neighbors gathered to watch bright programs, while he sat there with a faint, proud smile. And the gifts, oh, the gifts. They weren't ordinary toys or candy. They were delicate Japanese dolls with silk kimonos, a music box from Switzerland that played soft tunes, books with pictures of New York skyscrapers that I much later realized were the city I now live in. Each gift was a piece of a distant world, brought back and placed in the little Ohio house. And Mom, in that glow, became even more radiant. New dresses made of good fabric, no longer homemade. A modern hairdryer. Expensive perfume in pretty glass bottles. She smiled more in photos from that time. Her beauty was no longer the simple farm girl beauty, but was polished by comfort and the pride of standing beside her talented husband. Their house became a place people admired. Her garden was the greenest thanks to strange new fertilizers Dad brought. Dinners sometimes had exotic dishes from foreign cookbooks. Everything shone, was new, promised a future without limits. All of that glow happened before I was born. It's like a beautiful but faded movie, replayed through other people's words and sepia-toned photos. It felt like a fairy tale about a faraway kingdom where everything was perfect. But the real movie of my childhood, the one alive with sound, smell, and feeling, starts with something completely different. A blue metal door. After the glow, there's always a collapse. I don't know when it started, but that dark blue company car stopped coming home. Dad took early retirement, a phrase that sounds gentle but tastes like an ending. We sold the nice house in the suburbs with its shady trees and big yard and moved back to an old house in the small town near my grandparents' farm. The nice things slowly disappeared. The huge color TV was replaced by an old black and white one from the attic. No more luxurious gifts from abroad. The smell of the house changed, from new books and perfume to the damp smell of old wood and pain medicine. But before everything fell apart completely, there was a short time when we still lived in that old suburban house. And it was there in the house that was once a symbol of success that I had my first real fear. I was 4. In my memory, everything is huge. The ceilings were so high, the hallway went on forever, and the garage door, a heavy metal door painted a peeling blue. That morning started in a rush. Dad's shoes clacked on the wooden floor as he put on his gray suit, the last good one he had. He was getting ready for an interview at some faraway port company. His face was tense, his eyes looking right through me as if I were a wall. Mom was busier than ever. She wore an old jacket, carrying baskets of fresh vegetables from the backyard garden. Vegetables she grew herself to sell for a little money. The smell of damp earth and greens from the baskets mixed with the old perfume she wore to hide the sweat. "Lily, be a good girl. Play here for a bit, okay? Mom's going to the market early to sell these quick." Mom's voice was hurried, full of worry. She kissed my forehead, a dry, quick kiss. Dad didn't say anything. He just nodded, his eyes already turned toward the old car that had replaced the company one. Then they left. Those 2 figures walked out the kitchen door, heading for the garage. I stood in the kitchen, holding my old teddy bear, listening to their footsteps clatter down the stairs, a heavy, powerful thump! That was the sound of the heavy blue metal door closing. Then came the cold, solid sound. Clank, clack, the sound of the lock sliding into place. And then silence crashed down. Not the nice quiet of morning. This was a heavy, thick silence, like a film wrapping around me. I ran to the garage door, where there was a small glass window to look outside, but I was too short. I could only see a thin strip of pale yellow light shining from under the bottom of the door. "Mom," I called, my voice small as a kitten's. No answer. "Dad?" Silence. The panic started slowly, like cold water seeping into my shoes. First, a tight feeling in my throat. Then my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my little chest. I put the teddy bear down and ran to the metal door. My hands, with tiny fingers and soft nails, started scratching at the peeling paint surface. Scritch, scratch. A sharp, hopeless sound. The paint was hard and ice cold under my fingertips. I scratched harder, until my fingertips burned and were probably scraped raw. But the door didn't move. It was a wall, a mountain. I cried, first sobs, then it burst into screams. "Mommy! Daddy! Open the door!" I screamed with all my might. My throat felt raw and sore. Tears and snot ran down, mixing, salty, on my lips. I hit the door with my tiny fists. A thud, thud. Weak sounds, quickly swallowed by the huge silence of the house. No one was there, not a sound. I stopped crying, held my breath to listen. Only the steady tick-tock from the wall clock in the living room, sounding like an iron heart beating slowly, uncaring. Morning sun shone through the crack under the door. A bright yellow stripe on the cold concrete floor. I slid down right there, my back against the metal door. The cold from the metal seeped through my thin pajamas, making me shiver. That stripe of sunlight moved so slowly, like a golden worm crawling on the floor. I watched it, eyes stinging, feeling empty and terrified inside. I wasn't hungry. I didn't miss Mom in a sweet way. There was just pure raw fear. Fear of this too big silence. It felt like a living thing swallowing me. Fear that Mom and Dad would never come back. Fear that I would be locked here forever, alone, with the ticking clock and the uncaring stripe of sunlight. That feeling of being abandoned. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical feeling. A cold rock sitting heavy in my stomach. A tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe only half an hour, but To a 4-year-old, it was forever. Until the sound of a key, clanking on the other side of the door, rang out, and the blue metal door groaned open. Light flooded in, and the figure of my mother appeared, her face tired and worried. "Lily, you're in here? Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I forgot." I burst into tears, rushed into her arms, clinging to her clothes. The smell of her sweat and the vegetables on her was the safest smell in the world at that moment. But the terror didn't vanish right away. It stayed like a tiny crack in glass. That fear soaked into me that day. It taught me my first lesson about how fragile things are, about how you can be left all alone in your own house. And I, at 4 years old, couldn't have guessed that this was just the beginning. It was only the opening act for a more terrible fear, one that would smash my world to pieces when I was 6. Moving back to the small town wasn't a peaceful homecoming. It felt like a step backward, and everyone could feel it, even if no one said it out loud. The old house from my grandparents, where we moved to, smelled of dust and old memories. Dad didn't wear suits to work anymore. Instead, he put on faded blue work clothes and heavy boots. Every evening, he came home with his shirt soaked in sweat, streaked with white plaster and red brick dust. His sweat didn't smell like aftershave or office papers anymore. It was the sharp, sour smell of exhaustion, of sun and wind and hours of hard physical work. He'd slumped down on the front porch step, pulling off his boots with a quiet groan. His hands, which once drew delicate technical plans, were now rough with calluses and small cuts. He'd look at his hands, then out at the empty fields. Those once deep blue eyes now looked like stagnant puddles. And Mom, she struggled in a different way. She took odd jobs on nearby farms, weeding, picking vegetables, harvesting corn. Her once soft hands grew darker, her fingers wrapped in Band-Aids from cuts and scrapes. In the evenings, she'd often just sit silently in the old armchair, her legs swollen, her eyes squeezed shut as if trying to push away some inner ache. The small kitchen no longer smelled of baking or fancy meals. Now it usually just smelled of simple stewed potatoes or pasta with canned sauce. And then the arguments began. They weren't loud or screaming. They were sharp whispers that came through the thin wall at night. "Shove. You don't understand anything, Sharon. Your whole world is this farm." Dad's voice, full of tiredness and a hidden scorn. "You think I wanted this? You're the one who—" Mom's voice would choke up, then fall silent. The next morning, the air in the house would feel thick, like before a storm. Mom and Dad avoided looking at each other. The clinking of dishes sounded harsher than ever. I'd sit quietly in the kitchen corner, trying to make myself small, hoping to become invisible. A feeling of unease lived in my stomach, like a small stone rolling around. Dad always told me and my siblings, "Forget about this farm, study hard, so you won't have to struggle like we do." He said it with a stern look, like an order to rise above. But every time he said it, I'd see my mother's eyes. The light in them, the gentle light from the stories of the town's flower, seemed to flicker and dim a little more. Those eyes would look down at her own rough hands, or out the window at the field, the thing Dad called this farm, with a vague sense of regret and a quiet hurt. She wouldn't say anything. She'd just turn away silently, wiping the table or washing dishes with a loneliness that made my chest ache. So I decided to be the good kid. I thought if I was well-behaved, if I did well, if I didn't cause any more trouble, then maybe my parents would be less tired. Maybe those sharp whispers would disappear. I sat down to study on my own very early. I tried to understand numbers and letters faster than any other kid in class. I brought home bright red A's and placed them on the kitchen table in front of them, with a secret hope. I kept my room neat without being asked. I learned to cook simple things like scrambled eggs or toast, so that when Mom was too tired, there would still be something on the table. I always tried to smile, talk happily about school, tell silly stories, hoping to see a rare smile on Mom's face or a brief, satisfied nod from Dad. A knot of anxiety was always tight in my stomach. I listened to every footstep, every voice in the house. Dad's sigh while watching the evening news made my heart beat faster. Mom's dry cough from the bedroom made me hold my breath. I became an expert at reading the mood. Just by the way Dad set his glass down, or the way Mom stared into space, I knew if that night would be another night of heavy silence, or more cutting whispers. I believed in the magic of being perfect. I naively thought I could fix everything with A's and a clean kitchen. But things only got worse. The cracks kept spreading. The disappointment in Dad's eyes grew deeper. Mom's sighs grew longer and heavier. The unease inside me grew, becoming a constant companion that whispered all my efforts were useless. And then, when I was 6, something more frightening than the arguments, more frightening than the suffocating silence, arrived. It didn't come at night, or during a fight. It came on a quiet afternoon with golden sunlight spread across the kitchen floor. My mother collapsed. After the day Mom collapsed in the kitchen, nothing was ever the same again. The sickness, something vague and scary, had officially moved into our house and settled in. Mom grew visibly weaker. Her already slim frame became fragile, like a dry twig in the wind. Her once rosy skin turned pale, a sickly bluish white, especially under her eyes. She still tried to get up, still tried to work, but every movement was slow, as if she was moving underwater. I saw her lean against the kitchen counter longer to catch her breath after washing a few dishes. Saw her sit down on the stairs, face pale after just walking back from the garden. She still smiled at me, but the smile was tired, just pulling up a little at the corners of her mouth, not reaching her eyes, which had lost their light. To fight it, Mom turned to packets of herbal medicine from the Chinese shopkeeper in town, and me, the 6-year-old good kid, was often sent to buy them. I remember the walk to that shop clearly. The strange smells of spices, dried fruit, and smoked meat hit my nose. The shopkeeper, a small, quiet man, would silently take 1 or 2 paper packets tied with string from a cabinet. Inside were roots and dried leaves I couldn't name, smelling bitter and pungent. That medicine smell became part of the house. It clung to the kitchen, to the laundry drying indoors, to the armchair where Mom often rested. It rushed into my nose every time I stepped inside. A strange, threatening smell that signaled something was wrong, very wrong. That smell also clung to my memory, becoming the smell of worry, of things I couldn't understand. Mom said the medicine would make her better. She'd sit at the table, staring into the cup of dark, steaming water, as if concentrating all her willpower into it. She'd hold her breath, take a gulp, then her face would wrinkle from the bitterness. I'd sit across from her, my heart clenching, hoping for a miracle. But the miracle didn't come. Instead, I started noticing tiny, dark, red streaks sometimes in the toilet water, or on a handkerchief she quickly hid in her pocket. Once, I saw her hurriedly washing a bedsheet with a small, reddish-brown stain. Her eyes avoided mine. Mom's life seemed to be leaking away, bit by bit, silently and mysteriously. And me, a 6-year-old kid, could only watch from a distance, with a confusion and fear that just kept growing. I didn't know what to ask, didn't know what to do. I just tried to shrink, to become even smaller and quieter, as if my very presence could make her more tired. My parents' bedroom became a frighteningly dark and silent place. Dad came home from work later, his face dusty and tired, but now covered with a thick layer of worry. He ate dinner in silence, his eyes occasionally darting toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. Some nights I'd wake up and hear Dad's murmuring from inside the room. Not arguing, but a voice full of helplessness, probably asking Mom how she felt. I rarely heard Mom's voice answer, just sighs or a short, weak reply. "I'm okay. Don't worry." The air in the house felt heavy as lead. That weight pressed on my chest every morning. I went to school with a floating feeling, my mind always on the dark, quiet room at home. I was scared when the phone rang, thinking it might be bad news. I was scared of ambulance sirens, even if they were just passing by on the main road. Then one day as I sat on the front step, doodling on the concrete with a piece of chalk, our kind neighbor, Mrs. Mary, walked by. She stopped and looked at me with eyes full of pity. Mrs. Mary had a gentle face and eyes that usually smiled, but today they were red-rimmed. "Poor little Lily," she said, kneeling down to my level. Her warm hands wrapped around my shoulders. She hugged me, a tight, shaky hug. The familiar smell of laundry detergent and baked goods on her didn't comfort me today. She whispered in my ear, her voice choked and full of regret. "You poor thing, your mother like this. I'm afraid she might—" She stopped, as if she'd swallowed something hot. She didn't dare or didn't want to finish the sentence. She just hugged me a little tighter, then stood up, quickly wiping the corner of her eye with a handkerchief and walked away fast. I sat there. The chalk fell from my hand, shattering into white dust on the gray concrete. In my head, Mrs. Mary's unfinished sentence played over and over. I'm afraid she might. Might what? Might not make it. Might leave us? She didn't say it. But I, a 6-year-old who was used to reading things left unsaid in my family, heard it. I heard the pain in her voice, the pity in that hug, and I heard the terrible things she didn't dare say out loud, that my mother might die. A cold chill ran down my spine, even though the day was still warm. The vague confusion and worry I'd felt for so long suddenly hardened into a clear, sharp, knife-cold fear. I looked toward the house door, where my mother was lying, and for the first time, the thought of a world without my mother appeared in my mind. It was empty, pitch black, and so cold I couldn't breathe. I didn't cry, I just sat there, frozen, while the neighbor's unfinished sentence and the bitter medicine smell from the house mixed together, becoming the first negative image of loss in my life. After Mrs. Mary's unfinished sentence, the world around me seemed to change. Not the scenery, but the way people looked at me. I became an object of pity, something to be discussed in whispered conversations. Neighbors, distant relatives started visiting more. They didn't just come to see my mother, but to look at me. They brought casseroles, sauces, or jars of homemade jam, but what they brought the most were their looks. Pitying, watery looks, looking down at me from above, sweeping over my hair, then darting back toward the closed bedroom door. Then they'd sigh, a deep, heavy sigh, as if holding a sky full of misfortune. They'd shake their heads, a slight regretful shake, as if everything was already decided. And then the whispers. They thought I couldn't hear, or that I wouldn't understand. I'd often sit in the corner of the living room, pretending to be absorbed in a coloring book, but my ears were always perked up, catching every sound, every word. Sharon looks terrible. There's no color in her face at all. Cousin's voice. I heard Bob's looking for work farther away, having a hard time. An uncle's voice. Then another woman's voice, quieter, full of sympathy but chilling. Poor little Lily. Might become an orphan soon. Orphan. That word hit my ear like a hammer. In the mind of a 6-year-old, the word orphan was tied to sad stories and books, to lonely, ragged children in old movies. It was the end of everything. It was a curse. And that curse, people were whispering, was about to fall on my head. That word clung to me. It clung like a parasite in my mind. During the day, it lurked in the pitying looks from adults, in the comforting but helpless pats on the shoulder. It hid in the sighs, in the head shakes. I started being afraid to go outside, afraid to see neighbors, because I didn't want to receive any more of those looks. But the nights were the real hell. When darkness fell and the house was quiet, the word escaped its shell and took shape. It became monsters in the shadows, the feeling of being alone in an empty house, the image of my mother disappearing and my father becoming a distant stranger. I had nightmares. In my dreams, I'd see myself standing alone in a huge cornfield, calling for my mother, but getting no answer, only the wind blowing with a sound like orphan, orphan. The fear wasn't a vague feeling anymore. It became something physical, concrete, controlling my body. Every time I thought of that word, my heart would pound, fast and hard, so hard I thought it would jump out of my chest. A painful cramp in my stomach made me hug myself. In the middle of a hot Ohio summer, I'd sometimes feel an icy cold run down my spine, making me shiver, goosebumps rising. My hands were always a little shaky, especially when I heard a strange noise at night. I started staying awake at night. Lying in bed, I'd try to listen. I listened for sounds from my parents' room, my mother's dry, wheezy cough, my father turning over and sighing. I counted my mother's breaths through the thin wall. If they were steady, I might doze off for a while. If it was quiet for too long, my heart would race again, and I'd lie still, eyes wide open in the dark, until I heard a small sound proving she was still breathing. I became a tiny, tense guard watching over my own mother's life. The fear grew so big I didn't know where to turn, and so I started to pray. In Sunday school, they taught us to pray for the sick, but me, in the utter terror of a 6-year-old, didn't dare ask for anything too big. I was afraid God would think I was greedy. I was afraid my prayer wasn't strong enough. So every night before sleeping, after listening for my mother's breath, I'd clench my small hands tight, squeeze my eyes shut, and whisper to God a simple, selfish prayer born from my deepest fear. Now, dear God, please, please don't let me be an orphan. Please don't let my parents get divorced. I repeated it like a mantra. To me at that time, those two things were almost the same. Losing my mother to the sickness or losing my family to a split. Both meant the collapse of the small world I knew. Both meant I'd become the abandoned child with nowhere to belong. I begged God to save me from the orphan fate everyone was whispering about, and from the broken future I could feel in the suffocating silence between my father and mother. My prayer wasn't hope. It was desperation. It was the silent scream of a child trying to hold onto the edge of a cliff with all the innocence and fear she had. You're listening to Inner Echo Stories channel. Please like and subscribe for more interesting stories. In the storm of my mother's illness, my father's image changed too. He wasn't the frustrated man slumping on the porch step anymore. He became a machine that worked, earned money, and stayed silent. He left for work before the sky was fully light. The sound of the old pickup truck starting up shattered the morning quiet, announcing a new day of burden. He came home when darkness had swallowed the whole town, with only a few streetlights flickering. By then I was usually in bed, but still awake, and I'd hear his heavy footsteps on the floor. That faded blue work shirt was now often covered in a fine white dust. Plaster. Mortar. But the strongest thing on it was sweat. His shirt was soaked, so soaked I imagined if you wrung it out, a stream of water would hit the floor. That sweat mixed with construction dust, making a sour, salty smell, completely different from the sweat of his suit days. It was the smell of effort pushed to exhaustion, of hours of labor under hot sun, or bitter cold just to earn each dollar. He talked less than ever. His face seemed frozen. Only the hard lines of tiredness and worry remained. He got irritated easily by small things. My shoes left in the wrong place, the TV being slightly too loud, dinner not being ready yet. These flashes of anger would flare up quickly, then die down, leaving an even colder silence behind. But I knew deep inside that irritation was fear. He was afraid of losing his job, afraid of not having enough money, afraid of the expensive bottles from the pharmacy or the bitter herbal packets from the Chinese shop. And above all, perhaps a vague, bigger fear he didn't dare name. I felt sorry for my dad. So sorry. I saw his back bending a little more each day, saw more gray hairs appearing at his temples, saw his calloused hands tremble slightly when he held the electricity bill. He was still a hero in my eyes, but a wounded hero, on his knees fighting an invisible enemy. But I was also afraid of him, afraid of his heavy silence, like a dark cloud always hanging overhead. Afraid of the look in his eyes every time he stood in the bedroom doorway looking inside where my mother lay. Those once deep blue eyes were now empty, looking at something shattered, the pieces too small to pick up and fix. That look wasn't disappointment with the outside world anymore, but absolute helplessness in the face of the world inside his own home. And that helplessness to a child was even scarier than anger. There was one evening I'll never forget. Dad came home later than usual. He didn't eat dinner. He just sat at the kitchen table under the dim yellow light, his hands clenched around a glass of water. He didn't drink. He just stared into the empty space in front of him, his face like a wooden statue, only his eyes alive with a numb pain. The sweat-soaked shirt was half-dried, leaving white salt rings on the fabric. I stood peeking from behind the living room doorframe, watching him. A strong desire rose in me to run to him, hug that broad back that was carrying too much, and ask, "Daddy, is Mom okay? Is everything going to be all right?" I wanted him to comfort me, to hear him say a reassuring word, even a false one. But my feet felt glued to the cold wooden floor. My throat tightened. An invisible wall, thick with silence, fear, and exhaustion had been built between us. I was afraid if I ran to him, I'd break that fragile space. Afraid he'd turn, and in those eyes, I'd only see helplessness with no answers. Afraid that my presence, his little girl, would just be one more burden for him to worry about. So I stood there, silently, just watching, and felt a raw, aching sadness scratching at my chest, mixed with lonely fear. We were only a few meters apart, but we were an endless distance away. Our house, then, in the eyes of a 6-year-old, was exactly like a small boat rocking in a storm, and the hull was leaking. Dad was the exhausted captain, his hands constantly bailing water with the small bucket of his meager salary. Mom was the badly wounded person, lying quietly below deck, life leaking out with every scoop of water. And me, I was the child clinging to the side of the boat, eyes wide with terror, looking down into the deep, dark, gaping water beneath us. And on that water's surface, I saw two words shimmering horribly: orphan. I couldn't just sit there and be scared. That feeling of helplessness burned inside a 6-year-old's heart, so I acted. I decided to become perfect, to become a child that no God or fate could refuse to grant a favor to. I became more grown-up than ever. I didn't need reminding to make my bed, to fold the blankets neatly. I learned to wash dishes very carefully without breaking a single one. I tried to memorize the whole grocery list, going to the supermarket with Dad or a neighbor, making sure I forgot nothing. I even tried to iron handkerchiefs flat, even though my hands were small and the iron was heavy. And I tried to be a source of joy. Every afternoon after finishing my homework, I'd go into Mom's room. I'd sit on the edge of the bed and tell her about school. I made up happy stories: the principal's dog running into the classroom, my friend Mary spilling red paint on her new shoes. I'd smile, a strained but determined smile, hoping to see the light return to my mother's eyes. I hid all my fears, the cruel whispers, the nightmares. I painted a world of only pink while my own heart was tight with worry. I believed in a simple magic, the magic of being good. I thought if I became so perfect, so helpful, didn't cause any more trouble, then God would see. He'd see how hard I was trying and take pity and hear my tiny nightly prayer: please don't let me be an orphan. I believed my perfection could bribe fate, could keep my mother here. Then one night, all the effort, all the compressed fear, spilled out in a moment of weakness. It was a rainy night. The steady sound of rain on the tin roof sounded so sad. I was in bed but couldn't sleep. In my head, the whispering, orphan, orphan, mixed with the rain. I got up barefoot and walked through the dark hall to my parents' room door. It was slightly open. Dad was asleep in the armchair next to the bed, probably exhausted. Mom lay still, eyes closed, but I could tell she wasn't sleeping. Her thin fingers were gently rubbing her forehead. I stepped inside, not making a sound. I sat down on the rug beside the bed, my back against the wooden bed frame, and just looked at my mother. Looked at her pale, bluish skin in the dim nightlight. Looked at the blue veins on the back of her hand. I sat there for a very long time, as if my presence could create an invisible shield, protecting her from everything bad that was lurking. Suddenly, my mother stirred. Her tired eyes opened, and she saw me. Her look was surprised, then softened. "Lily?" Her voice was hoarse, weak as a thread. "Why aren't you asleep?" I opened my mouth, meaning to say, "I'm scared," or "I'm worried about you." But those words didn't come out. Instead, from the deep pit of fear, built up over weeks and months, a question I'd always hidden burst out. In a trembling voice so small I thought it wasn't mine. "Mom, you won't leave me, right?" I paused, swallowing, my throat tight and bitter. Promise me, promise me." In that moment, I wasn't the good kid, the trying to act strong anymore. I was just a scared 6-year-old, begging, pleading for an assurance about my fragile future. Tears spilled out, silently running down my cheeks, but I didn't cry out loud. I looked at my mother with watery eyes, waiting. My mother was silent for a moment. Her eyes were wet too. Then she slowly reached out her hand. That thin, weak hand trembled as it touched my cheek, wiping away the tears. She tried to shift closer and wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into her. The warmth from her body, though weak, was still the warmest thing in the world. She whispered into my hair, her voice full of sorrow and an unnamed endurance. "I promise, I will try, I promise you." I held her tight, breathing in the smell of medicine and her weak body. That promise should have comforted me. But the sensitive heart of a child heard something else. My mother's voice was too small, too weak. That promise sounded as fragile as morning mist, which could vanish with just a ray of sun or a gentle breeze, and I knew deep down that promise wasn't something my mother could decide by herself. There were bigger, scarier things in control. Her draining health, harsh fate, and also the discouragement and tiredness that was slowly pushing my father away. The silence between them grew thicker, heavier every day. Like another illness, just as dangerous. That night, holding my mother, I didn't feel relieved. On the contrary, I understood something even more heartbreaking. My mother's promise was just a comfort, and I, A 6-year-old had begun learning to listen to the scariest language of all, the distant silence between my father and mother. I knew the real battle to keep my family from falling apart was only just beginning. Eventually, the smell of the bitter herbal medicine faded from the house. It was replaced by another smell, the smell of medical disinfectant, of neatly packaged prescription pills, and of a small, fragile hope. Luck finally smiled, even if only half a smile. A distant relative introduced my parents to a good doctor in the next town over. It wasn't a miracle, but science and a correct diagnosis finally arrived. My mother got the right treatment. Those brown packets were thrown in the trash. New bottles with long Latin names appeared on the kitchen shelf. And then slowly, like a sapling after a storm, my mother began to recover. Color gradually returned to her cheeks, no longer pale. She could sit up longer, then stand, then take a few steps around the room. Meals were no longer brought to her in bed. She appeared at the dinner table again, even if she just sat there, her hand shaking as she held a spoon. The crisis named orphan had retreated. It didn't disappear, didn't turn to smoke. It settled down, sank into a dark corner of my heart, froze into a scar. I didn't stay awake at night listening for her breath anymore. But sometimes in sudden quiet moments, that fear would surface again, like a tiny thorn pricking my heart, reminding me how fragile everything could be. And so we had a victory. My mother had gotten back up, but when she stood up, I realized she wasn't the same woman as before. Half of her radiant energy, her sunny smile from before, had been swept away. A deep tiredness had settled in her eyes, a profound resignation, as if she'd just come through a battle and knew she might never fully recover. She was still beautiful, but it was a faded beauty, with new, deep wrinkles around her eyes. And our house, after the storm of illness, didn't return to the peace from before. It wasn't a place of tense arguments or anxious whispers about death anymore. It fell into a new state, a tired, heavy silence, full of things left unsaid. It was in this new silence, with the increasingly sharp eyes of a child who had known fear, that I began to see more clearly than ever the invisible wall built between my father and mother. Dinner became a silent ritual. The sound of spoons and forks on plates was so loud, so sharp in the still air. Dad, after a day's work, would sometimes try to start a conversation. At the construction site today, Tom knocked over a whole bucket of mortar, he'd say, his voice flat. Mom would nod, eyes on her plate. A short reply. No curiosity, no follow-up question. Her gaze was distant, as if her mind was somewhere else, perhaps in the memory of her bedridden days, or in the constant tiredness of her body. When it was Mom's turn, she might talk about the tomatoes in the garden starting to fruit, or about the new neighbor who moved in. Dad would look up from his newspaper or the TV screen, look at her for a moment, then utter a, dry. Then he'd sink back into his own world, a world probably full of numbers of failure and plans that never came true. They didn't argue much anymore. Maybe because they were both too tired after the recent crisis. Tired from worry, tired from the financial strain, tired from the loneliness within their own marriage. But this silence, I realized, was even scarier than the arguments. The arguments at least proved there was interaction, there was a tension, even if negative to each other. But this silence, it was indifference. It was the acceptance that the other person had become part of the scenery, like the wall or the table, no longer capable of surprising or deeply hurting anymore. They were like two old trees, standing side by side through many stormy seasons. From a distance, people might think they were still one unit, but if you came close, you'd see the trunks were no longer entwined. Their roots had stopped growing toward each other long ago, perhaps when the crisis began. Or even earlier. Now, they just shared the same patch of barren land that was this house, sucking up the meager nutrients of life, but living separate lives in silence. And me, I was like a sapling growing from that soil. I grew up in the cold shade created by those two canopies that no longer touched. I absorbed the silence, learned to read the distant looks, and carried within me an unending longing for a kind of warm light I'd perhaps never truly had. I was still the good kid, but now I knew how in a different way. I knew that some cracks couldn't be fixed with A's or a good dinner. And I began learning to live with those cracks, in the silent shade of two old trees slowly drifting apart. Time passed. I was 10. The orphan scar had healed, but it left a patch of skin more sensitive, more easily hurt by any bump. And one of those bumps came from my father's own words, which he meant to be encouraging. One autumn evening, Dad sat with me at the kitchen table, helping with math. He was still good with numbers. Even though his hands were calloused from hammers and shovels, when he held a pen, the lines were still clear and logical. I had just solved a hard fraction problem, a topic that had given me a headache for days. Dad looked over my work and nodded. A rare light, maybe pride, flashed in his blue eyes, which were usually dull with tiredness. He put the pen down, turned to me, and placed his heavy but gentle hand on my shoulder, a soft pat. "That's my girl," he said, his voice warmer and deeper than usual. "Keep studying like that." I looked up, beaming, expecting more praise. But then he continued, and his voice took on a different tone, of familiar bitterness. "Forget this country farm. Study hard. Grow up and go far away. Don't let your life be small like—" He stopped abruptly as if he'd swallowed an ice cube. He looked over my shoulder toward the sink where my mother was silently washing the last dinner dishes. But I knew what he meant to say. 3 short words, sharp as a knife, "like your mother." The whole warm kitchen seemed to freeze in an instant. The sound of running water from the faucet was suddenly very loud, very sharp. The air grew thick. I didn't dare look up at Mom. I was afraid of what I'd see on her face, but out of the corner of my eye I saw it. Her hand scrubbing a plate suddenly stopped. Her thin fingers, the knuckles a little swollen from arthritis, tightened on the plate's edge. Her small thin back in the old apron seemed to flinch, to curl in a little like a small animal that's been hit. Just for a second. Then she went back to washing, but the smooth rhythm was gone. It became stiff, mechanical. Mom didn't say a word, didn't turn around, didn't argue. She just dried her hands on her apron, slowly, carefully. Then she turned her back, walked out of the kitchen, and headed down the dark hallway. The quiet sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. Then a very soft click, the sound of the bedroom door closing. That sound wasn't loud or angry. It was heartbreakingly gentle. But to me, it echoed in my heart like a sob held in until it choked, a sigh shattered into 1,000 pieces of silence. Inside me, a new feeling burst out, stronger and clearer than any fear before. Anger. A small, hot flame began to burn in my chest. For the first time, I didn't just feel sorry for my mother. I felt angry for her, angry at the unfairness, angry at my father's words. What was this country farm? It wasn't just a piece of land. It was where my mother was born, where she took her first wobbly steps on the soft grass, where she learned to milk a cow, pick her first apple, watch brilliant sunsets behind the cornfields. It was where her parents poured their sweat and tears to build a life. It was her world, beautiful, simple, and real. And my father, with his engineering degree and his trips around the world, saw that world, saw her life, as something small, country, something to forget. The encouragement meant for me turned out to be a knife, accidental, on purpose, cutting into everything my mother held dear. That night after Dad had gone upstairs, I secretly got a glass of water and tiptoed to my mother's door. I knocked softly and went in. She wasn't crying. She was sitting in the old armchair by the window, leaning slightly, looking out into the pitch-black backyard. The faint moonlight through the glass cast her shadow on the wall, a lonely, small shape. "You okay, Mom?" I whispered, setting the water glass on the table next to her. She turned. The moonlight fell on her face, making the wrinkles and tiredness clearer. She smiled at me. A very soft, very tired smile, but trying to seem okay. "I'm fine, sweetie," she said softly. "Your dad, he just wants what's best for you. He wants you to have a big future." But in her eyes, the eyes I'd learned to read since I was little, I didn't see agreement or understanding. I saw a deep loneliness, a hurt so familiar she wasn't even angry anymore, just a sorrowful acceptance. And for the first time, a thought flashed in my 10-year-old mind, a bold, almost rebellious thought that made my heart race. I wish Mom never had to hear words like that again. The thought startled me, scared me. It was like a spark flying from the angry flame in my heart, touching the boundary of the loyalty I still felt for my father. But I couldn't put it out. It was planted, a seed of awakening, about the injustice the woman I loved most had to endure right in her own home. And that seed, though tiny, had begun to quietly crack open in the dark. If I had to sum up my childhood memories in just two images, these would be them. They are like the two worn-out sides of an old coin, worn down by time and sweat. The first image is my father. On a hot, sticky summer afternoon when the sun was still high and the air thick with the smell of hay and road dust, Dad came home in his beat-up pickup truck. He got out, his body tired, but his back still trying to stay straight. The bright orange high-vis shirt, the kind construction workers have to wear, was covered in dust and plaster streaks. But what hit me wasn't the color or the dirt. It was the wetness. The shirt was soaked from the collar down to the waist, stuck to his body, outlining every tense muscle in his broad, burdened shoulders. He took the shirt off, and I saw it more clearly. The shirt was heavy. He picked it up, twisted a corner. And from the fabric, a stream of clear but thick water trickled out, dripping onto the hot ground with a little puff of steam. It was sweat. Thick, salty sweat. So salty that when it dried, it left white, speckled streaks on the back of the shirt. Salt. That image of the soaked, heavy shirt with the white salt stains was the very picture of burden. Of the rigid responsibility he couldn't or wouldn't let go of. Of the silent, bitter sacrifice to earn every last dollar to feed the family and buy the pills that kept my mother alive. That was the sweat of a man trading his dreams to keep his duty. The second image is my mother. In the burning, scorching midday sun, when Dad was still at the construction site. Mom was no longer bedridden, but her health was never the same. Yet she still took a job harvesting in the neighbor's wheat field for extra money. I went to find her, bringing a jug of cold water. I saw her from a distance. In a sea of brilliant gold and blinding sunlight, her small body was bent over, holding a sickle, her movements slow but steady. I got closer, and I smelled something, a faint, burnt smell, like singed hair. It was my mother's hair. The golden hair once compared to ripe wheat to sunlight was now scorched by the sun. The strands were dry, brittle, giving off that sun-scorched smell. She wore an old straw hat, but the sun still found its way. Her hands and thin cloth gloves were still rough. The back of her shirt was soaked too, but it was a different kind of sweat. The sweat of wrestling directly with the earth, with the heat, with every heavy bundle of wheat. This was a sweat of holding on to the land her own husband called country, holding on to the only way she knew to contribute, to assert her own value, even if that value was scorned by her life partner. She sacrificed her already fragile health to stay in her world, and in doing so, helped feed her family. They both worked hard, they both sweated, both sacrificed to exhaustion for us, their children. But the cruelest, saddest irony was this. That sacrifice, instead of pulling them together into the same trench, seemed to be digging a deeper pit between them. Dad sacrificed, laboring brutally, with the perhaps faded hope that one day he could get us out of the small country world my mother represented. Mom sacrificed, holding on and wrestling with that very land to sustain the family right where she belonged. And in doing so, she became the very thing Dad wanted us to escape. They sacrificed in opposite directions, and the more they sacrificed, the farther apart they grew. Now, at 30, sitting in my distant New York apartment, looking back on those images, I don't see them with the eyes of a scared, confused, or angry child anymore. Now it's understanding. A painful, sorrowful understanding. I understand that they tried, each in their own way, with everything they had and everything they knew. Dad with an engineer's mind and rigidity, Mom with a quiet resilience, and the pure love of someone tied to the land. But they were like two people trying to put together the same puzzle. They thought they were working on the same thing, but really each was holding pieces from two completely different pictures, one depicting skyscrapers and distant horizons, the other a cornfield and an old house. And they kept trying, getting tired, until they realized the pieces wouldn't fit, and by then it was too late, or they were too tired to start over. And me, the daughter who carries half my father's traits, ambition, logic, a longing to go far, but has my mother's heart. Sensitive, easily hurt, deeply attached to roots and family. I grew up right inside that contradiction, nourished by both opposing worlds. My childhood was a stack of fears. Fear of being locked behind the metal door, fear of becoming an orphan, fear of the sharp whispered arguments, and later, fear of the dead. Cold silence. I used to pray desperately, with the hopeless faith of a child, that my parents would never get divorced, that my family had to keep its shape, even if it was cracked inside. But now as an adult, now that I've truly gone far, as my father once wished, standing in this high-rise in the city, looking out at the big world he yearned for, and at the same time, the farther I go, the more deeply I understand the loneliness, the hurt in the small world my mother chose or was trapped in. I have a different wish, a wish completely opposite to my childhood prayer. A wish that sometimes, when I think of it, startles even me, leaves me confused, wondering if I'm a bad daughter. And that is the real confession I've carried from Ohio to New York, hidden under the shell of a successful, independent woman. It starts with a sentence, a thought I've never dared to say out loud, even on my loneliest nights. I wish Mom had divorced Dad.